Hello and welcome to Living a Culture of Life podcast by Human Life International. I'm your host, Colleen, and I'm joined today by Dr. Joe Malone. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
It's great to have you in person. We had you on the show a few weeks ago, and now we can have another conversation in person and get to continue our conversation.
It's great to see you in person, and you have a great area that you live in.
Yeah, it's beautiful
Beautiful.
here. And I love the fact that we can have an in-person conversation because
Mhm.
I like those better than the remote ones in general. So
Same here.
yeah, this will be good. So, in our last episode, we were talking about how men and women bond biologically, all of the chemical things that go into that. And this time, we're going to be talking about how hormonal birth control disrupts that process, how
Mhm.
it interferes with the type of men that women are attracted to, and just interferes with men and women's relationships in general.
Mhm.
Hormonal birth control,
Yes.
obviously. So, let's just jump into that. How does hormonal birth control affect the bonding process of men and women?
Well, it's amazing, Colleen, but I was just talking about this yesterday to a bunch of college students and professors, and the professors didn't even know about these effects. But the really bad effect that a lot of birth control has on young women is that when they're on it, they are attracted to men that they wouldn't necessarily be attracted to if they weren't on it. And yeah.
Why does that happen?
Well, it causes changes in the hormonal makeup of the brain to where the brain and the body of the woman thinks that you can look at it two ways, like their second half of their cycle, like the
Mhm.
luteal part of the cycle, or pregnancy, they're pregnant. In other words, it shuts down the normal cycle. And in the normal cycle, in the follicular stage, the first part, the first half,
Mhm.
basically, other than the period, the time of the period, after the period's over, there's usually a really sharp increase in sexual desire, for one thing. And um, basically from day 8, if day 1 is the start of the period and day
Mhm.
5 is your typical end,
Mhm.
so the third day after the end, so 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, maybe 14 even, um, women's estrogen levels increase sharply.
Okay.
Normally, this is a normally cycling woman. Okay.
Who's not on birth control? Just
Correct.
your average woman who's not using any kind of birth control.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. We'll talk about the normal, and then we'll talk about what birth control
Okay. Yeah.
does to it. So, and not only does her estrogen increase greatly, and I mean when I say greatly, I mean greatly isn't strong enough. It increases by 200 times
Wow.
in that what we call that fertile window,
Mhm.
because women are only fertile for like 5 days, 5 to 6 days, and
Mhm.
those are the days we're talking about. And so estrogen increases by 200 times, and that, in percentage terms, that's 20,000 times. So if you think about that like that, it's just a huge difference. And estrogen is really a sex receptive hormone. Testosterone, which also rises in the woman at this time, but again, compared to the men's amount of testosterone, it's not very much. But it's a sex seeking hormone.
Okay.
So the natural cycle then is for that to happen, and so between the eighth day and about the 14th day, sexual desire rises sharply, and again, the whole follicular process of the egg maturing and being released, that all happens. And if sexual intercourse happens somewhere in that time period, and the egg is met by the sperm somewhere along the way, I guess in the fallopian tubes, that then pregnancy takes place.
Mhm.
And if it doesn't happen, then the second half of the cycle kicks in, and the progesterone rises, estrogen starts dropping, and and the woman goes into a phase of basically going from a really highly desirous stage during the follicular stage to a more of a chilled, relaxing, not very motivated, and especially toward the end,
Mhm.
of the 28 to 30 days. So what birth control does, what hormone birth control does, is it takes that first part, that follicular part, the part that where the estrogen is sharply rising and testosterone is rising, and it just basically flattens it out.
Okay.
And so basically for the whole month, the woman feels like she's in the luteal phase, which is the kind of not motivated, certainly not sexually motivated, and not necessarily motivated to find a man that has high genetic quality. In that in that fertile window, she will have the greatest chance during the month to be interested in alpha male types, the genetically fit guy.
Mhm.
Um, so again, that's that first half, especially again, that 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 time period.
Mhm.
And then it fades into the second half. if she were to, have sex with a gentleman at that time, she would probably choose, if she didn't have one,
Mhm.
and if she was fairly, promiscuous, I guess, she would probably choose someone that was more of a trustworthy type of a person, more of a good dad, maybe in the future, a
Mhm.
husband you wouldn't have to necessarily worry about, wandering, that type of thing. So with birth control pills or otherwise,
Mhm.
when you flatten that out, when you take basically that first part out, then you take away her normal desire for looking for a guy that may be more genetically fit, maybe more rough, maybe more daring, that
And
type of thing.
genetically dissimilar to her, I believe, as well. I believe that women
Right,
on birth control tend to be attracted to men more genetically similar versus women who are just naturally cycling are
right.
more attracted to men that have different genetics because that means that their children are going to have like the best immune system because you're getting two different immune
Yeah,
systems and having the
yeah.
best of both worlds. So it doesn't seem like a problem that a woman would be more attracted when she's on birth control to a man who is a good dad or very trustworthy.
Mhm.
So what's the problem with that?
Great question. Here's the problem, Colleen, and audience. What's been happening in certain situations, and not always, but women that have this happen to them and go into this kind of altered mental state and
Mhm.
altered attraction state. Let's give you the scenario, the probably the typical scenario. A man and woman in our society today, they're attracted to each other, and maybe thinking of maybe down the road getting married, but they're not saving sex for marriage.
Mhm.
Very typical. They start, and again, they probably, if they're having sex, they start to. She may already be on birth control,
Mhm.
and she may be choosing her this man, on birth control, and be thinking, her brain may be thinking like the second half of
Mhm.
the cycle, or if she were pregnant. So she's already in the state you just described. She's more attracted to a man that would be like maybe remind her of her family, or be genetically similar, that type of thing.
Mhm.
And so as they go through this relationship, and she is again on these birth control pills, or she goes on them to keep from getting pregnant because they start having sex.
Mhm.
When they get married, typically they get married, and maybe whatever, a year or two go down the line, and they decide we want to have children, you know, and so she goes off the birth control pills, and when she does, she finds she's attracted to these other guys, guys that are, more genetically fit, rougher, more masculine, more of the bad guy type of thing, and she's no longer necessarily attracted to her husband, and so when she was on birth control and they were getting together and dating and probably and having sex and that type of thing, she was attracted to him. But then, when they didn't want to have a baby, but when they want to have a baby, and she goes off the birth control, now she's no longer attracted to him. She's attracted to these other guys, maybe the guys at work or whatever.
Mhm.
So it's a bad thing for a marriage, for one thing,
Mhm.
because you don't want the wife to now be attracted to other guys and not her husband.
It seems like for a woman who's naturally cycling, she gets the best of both worlds because
Hmm.
during the first half of her cycle, she's attracted to men who are genetically dissimilar, who are very masculine, manly,
Yeah,
high testosterone levels, I'm guessing.
right.
Versus, and then as she moves into the second half of her cycle, she can then, if she's dating him, also evaluate him. Would he be a good dad? Would he be a good provider? And kind of both parts of her brain are working in sync to be able to, if you're dating chastely, be able to determine that this gentleman is going to be a good husband and father going down the line.
Mhm.
But a woman who's on birth control loses that first half of am I actually attracted to him on a biological level and
Mhm.
only gets to evaluate him on the is he a good dad, is he a good provider perspective, which again, those aren't bad qualities to be looking for,
Right.
but you need to, I guess, for a good marriage, have the attraction to your spouse as well as
Mm.
the recognition that they're going to be a good provider and a good dad to your children. Is that
Right.
a good sum
Oh,
up of it?
yeah, it's perfect.
Okay.
Better than I could explain it. It's that chemistry. I mean,
Mhm.
normally it's chemistry, that first half of the cycle, that kind of animal magnetism type of
Mhm.
thing. If the chemistry isn't there, that's a kind of the base of um, why they're attracted to each other, and why they're attracted to each other. That animal chemistry, that pheromonal,
Mhm.
chemistry. That's telling them, if they are highly attracted to each other, that they're going to probably have really healthy babies, as you were
Mhm.
saying, because they are dissimilar enough, as far as their immune systems and other things like that, that the baby that's going to be produced from them is going to have excellent one, the combination of both of theirs.
Mhm.
So um, that animal magnetism or that animal attraction, that I guess just really visceral and like physical
Mhm.
attraction is an important element to it, as you just described.
Mhm.
The other part is important as well because there's so many young women that end up, all on that side. They're all on, all on that.
They're always going after the, like, very masculine man and
Yeah,
not looking at the good father qualities as well.
yeah, and it's interesting because the research shows that the not all, of course, but the high proportion of masculine, the alpha male types, don't aren't very good at staying married. They aren't
Mhm.
very good at staying true to that one woman, So there's a downside to being too focused on the follicular half,
Mhm.
and the animal part of it, so to speak, just physical attraction. But like you said, you described it really well. I think the combination of the two is what's supposed to happen because you're supposed to have maybe initially you're going to have that attraction, that
The
very
spark, the chemistry.
yeah, chemistry is really, I mean, it literally is chemistry
Mhm.
because it's pheromonal, so it's things that are going between the two, that they don't perceive it consciously,
Mhm.
but they just feel it.
It was interesting because when I was preparing for the podcast, I was reading an article from a magazine that was quoting a book. I think it's by Dr. Sarah Hill, the Your
Mhm.
Brain on Birth Control. I think
Yeah,
that's what they were quoting.
good book.
And they were talking about how women who are on birth control are going to be attracted to genetically similar men. But what will happen often is if they get married and she goes off birth control, they might have trouble conceiving because of the similarities in genes as well. So
Mhm.
because you're not necessarily attracted to someone who is genetically equipped to be
Mhm.
able to have a good healthy pregnancy and good healthy children,
Mhm.
not that that's always going to happen, but there is this risk that women run in marrying someone who is very genetically similar, who they're only attracted to on birth control because they aren't necessarily going to have as easy a time conceiving or have as healthy children in the long run. And I
Yeah.
thought that was a really interesting point because I'd never thought about how it
Mhm.
affects the actual fertility and
Mhm.
ability to conceive. I only knew about it from the
Mhm.
what type of men are you attracted to.
Yeah, exactly, and that's a bit of what I was getting at with I should have gone a little further with it, but when you have those dissimilar, immune systems and again, that really, really strong physical attraction, that's really the body's way of telling everybody that you're probably gonna the man is probably gonna be able to get her, pregnant readily.
Okay,
Yeah,
interesting.
because she's not gonna be able I mean, she would not be as readily impregnated by somebody if she actually was, it was a genetically similar person, literally
Mhm.
in real life. Let's say like a cousin or something like that. It's not
Mhm.
it's not gonna be as effective to create a pregnancy with 2 cousins,
Mhm.
as it is with somebody that's very dissimilar. And probably the 2 cousins aren't gonna be attracted to each other anyway, very,
Mhm.
very much, or heaven forbid, siblings or whatever. I think it's in a situation like that where that has actually happened, where there's been incest like that. I think generally it doesn't happen for the most part as far as a pregnancy happening,
Mm.
or if it does, there's all kinds of issues. I mean, the baby has all kinds of
As
issues.
you
So
see with all the European dynasties back in,
yeah,
like, the Middle Ages and, like, when they would all marry cousins
yeah.
to be able to keep the bloodline going, and you saw all the deformities that came out of that.
Yeah, and I think that they literally a lot of them, I don't recall a particular case, but, just generally, I think that they had trouble
Mhm.
if it was a relative of some kind like that. They had trouble conceiving, and
Mhm.
that was a huge deal to them because that line, that especially that male heir, I
Mhm.
mean, they would work and work and work, but if they were close, if they had some kind of a relative, situation going on, it's like shooting yourself in the foot because you definitely need that, the two gene patterns to be separate from each other,
Mhm.
and then again, I feel like God has put it in us to have the attraction to that other person that we're
Mhm.
going to end up, if it does become a marriage, we're going to end up, creating a beautiful set of children
Mhm.
off of that because of the way we are dissimilar and that infatuation or lust or love, that's there at the beginning. That's signifying that there's going to be a really, really good matchup there, and it's
Interesting.
meant to be. So again, I think it's a God
Mhm.
ordained thing, as far as
He sets us up to be attracted to people where you're gonna be able to have healthy children, and then because you're not attracted to people that are, like, family members, you're not gonna end up in those weird situations where
yeah,
cousins marry each other or anything like that. You're kind of genetically what's the word? Genetically, like, ordered towards the other and
yeah,
having good, healthy children, and that's leads into the attraction as well.
Exactly. The
Interesting.
attraction and healthy children, I think, go together.
Is
Yeah.
it true that women on birth control are like attracted to men that are more effeminate?
Well, I think that would be part of it. Yeah.
Okay. I was asking about the effeminate men because I've heard people theorize that's why the Harry Styles, the Timothy Chalamets of the world, like you have more effeminate stars in movies, and people were theorizing that the reason that they're kind of like the idols of all the teenage girls is because you have so many girls that are on birth control. That's the type of men they're attracted to.
Mm,
Versus you look back in like the 50s and people are attracted to the John Wayne, the Gregory Peck types that had more masculine
yeah.
qualities about them. And I thought that was a really interesting explanation for why the type of men that are like the pop stars of the day
Mm.
or movie stars of the day have changed throughout the years. So,
I think that's very interesting too. And to throw something else in on that, you know, you may or may not be aware of this, but for about the last 40 years at least,
mhm.
testosterone levels have been dropping like a
Mm.
percent a year.
Why is that?
Well, the science doesn't really know absolutely for sure
Hmm.
yet, but the suspicion is that it's the chemicals that are going into the environment that haven't been there in the past before
Hmm.
that.
Do you
So
think some of that is the fact that women on birth control are putting estrogen in the water?
some of it is, yeah,
Hmm.
yeah, and that's a problem that nobody seems to be able to address because it's just in the system, in the urine, into the water, and you can't filter that out of the water. So
Hmm.
everybody's getting
From I
too
did
much
a little
estrogen.
bit of research about that because we
Hmm.
have an animated video on that topic,
Hmm.
and it basically sounded like in order for birth control pills to have estrogen that isn't just washed out by the liver, they
Hmm.
have to be synthetic and they have to be very strong.
Hmm.
But what happens is it ends up in the water, and because they make it very strong because it's the synthetic
Hmm.
estrogen, it then cannot be filtered out by or not as easily filtered out by water in like the water
Right.
treatment plants.
And that and also then the plastics. And so
Hmm.
there's so many things so many liquids that we drink out of plastics, or they're packed into plastics, and so the plastics have a very synthetic version of estrogen in them too, BPA especially. So
Hmm.
there's there's another chemical called phthalates that again it's in like rugs, fibers. It's all in all these different things that and people absorb it. They absorb it through the skin, and it's one of the main ones that they're suspecting is behind this
Interesting.
male. It's affecting the males the most. Not only is it lowering testosterone counts, but by about a percent a year. So
Okay.
dropped 40% in the last 40 years. So
Wow.
so your guy from now that's born into this
Hmm.
is going to be looking at it's like a much lower testosterone level over his lifetime because he's in that environment. The ones like my age that were born in that the old environment, they have a lot less of a tendency because it's all already built up as far as their peak levels. So,
Interesting.
and then along with that, I want to get back to the thing you said earlier about the births,
Hmm.
about the close relatives and the births, and that type of thing, because I think it figures into another issue. Uh, but not only is it testosterone dropping by about a percent a year, but also sperm counts are.
Mm.
And so as sperm counts are dropping, again, this who the young women are attracted to, again, kind of all of it works together. If testosterone is dropping and sperm counts are dropping, then and the chemistry of the man on the inside is changing like this, the young man,
Hmm.
then what's going to be out there, on the market, so to speak, is going to be a lot lower testosterone product than has been in the past. Like you mentioned, John Wayne and the 50s and 60s.
Hmm.
Yeah. So, then the other thing that I think this affects,
Hmm.
and I think this is interesting to think about. It's interesting, but it's sobering and alarming, I guess you'd say.
Hmm.
But I don't know if you've heard about the birth gap situation. The birth.
No. What's
Okay.
the birth cap?
Well, it's actually a documentary that was made by, I think he's an economist,
Okay.
but he picked up on the fact that around the world, the developing countries in the world, I'm sorry, the developed
Hmm.
the countries in the world, like us, South Korea, Italy, China for sure,
Hmm.
a bunch of other ones, are they're experiencing an amount of births now that are so much less than the births that have been in the past that they're not being able to replace.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
That
So demographic winter.
correct.
Do you think? then that the fertility, because so a man's sperm count is lower and he's not necessarily as fertile as the man 50 years ago. Do you think that that demographic winter is being caused by infertility though, or do you think it's being caused by the prevalence of contraception and abortion? Because it seems like contraception and abortion is a much bigger part of that puzzle, and not that infertility doesn't play into it, but I feel it seems like
Mhm.
most of that birth gap is coming from people not wanting kids and avoiding kids rather than people not being able to have kids.
It's both, I think,
Okay.
and I think that a lot of young women um, think that they have a long time
Mhm.
to have babies. They think they're not aware of their fertility kind of window,
Mhm.
and fertility window really for women. The peak of fertility is age 19 to 29.
Okay.
For men, it's 24 to 26. Okay,
Mhm.
so I think on this birth gap situation that we're talking about, the young women again. There's all these things about getting your degree, your undergraduate degree, getting your master's degree,
Mhm.
getting a profession, and both maybe the male and the female are both trying to get established in professions. They find themselves very quickly at the early 30s.
Mhm.
And in a lot of cases, I think that they don't necessarily, at that point, they don't realize that they're not able to find a suitable mate. They thought they
Mm.
were going to just be able to do these things and then find somebody readily.
Mhm.
But the pool, available pool has dropped as far
Mhm.
as the ones that they would maybe find desirable. So it's a combination of things. And when it and it doesn't help the things we've been talking about, this the sperm counts dropping and the testosterone counts dropping and that type
Mhm.
of thing, which takes away what used to be the normal drive that particularly the males had to try to get a wife to be able to carry out sexual
Mhm.
activity, and not only that, the hookup culture allows much more free sexual activity. And then
Mhm.
to throw one more log on the fire, porn.
Mhm.
Porn has had a huge effect, I think. So it's all really made it where our rate of marriage has dropped so much, and married women have many more children on average than unmarried.
Mhm.
So the more married women we're seeing, the more the birth gap isn't a problem because they're
Mhm.
they're having children, particularly if they're getting married younger. But with the average age of marriage at 27, and then for women and 30 for men, a lot of them are finding themselves in a situation where it's difficult to get pregnant,
Mhm.
and they weren't anticipating that. So at age 30, you have half the chance of getting pregnant as you did at age 20 as a
Mm.
woman. And,
Interesting.
and if by 35, it's really, really dropped down, and between 35 and 45, it becomes almost near impossible without artificial means. The artificial means are very expensive, and they have some really downsides that most people don't talk about.
Mhm. Like IVF, and they're, well, first of all, they're immoral because you're
Mm,
separating sex from babies, but
right.
they're also, yeah, not healthy and not necessarily gonna create good children either,
Yeah,
so
and here's how the good children, they're not creating good children, that's a good way to put it, happens. Most people may not know this, but when they have to kind of stoke the woman's fertility with these
Mhm.
fertility drugs, and they create these multiple eggs,
Mhm.
coming, and they create the situation where twins, triplets, even beyond, even more than that, are
Mhm.
happening much more often. And so when there's triplets, usually the birth weight is so much smaller, like
Mhm.
5 pounds, each, maybe less.
Mhm.
And the lower the birth weight, the less of a survival chance that the babies have. So they end up having all these babies die that
Mhm.
wouldn't have died before if they just would have gotten pregnant younger
Mhm.
in their life.
Well, and a lot of times what happens with IVF as well is that 90%, well, a bunch of the embryos are killed off, either frozen and they end up dying. I think it's 90%. And or what happens is if a woman gets pregnant with multiple children, they'll use abortion to like basically weed out the different children and pick one to be carried so that you don't end
Mm,
up with it at low birth rates. So it ends up, that process ends up killing multiple children,
right.
even if the couple does succeed in having a baby. So
Right.
there's a lot of ethical problems with it.
Exactly.
I actually want to go back to talking about the effect of birth control on men and
Mm.
women's bonding.
Sure.
Does a woman being on birth control affect how a man is attracted to her?
Well, that's interesting. That's an interesting question.
Because I've never heard anyone talk about that. I've seen a lot of articles being like, women don't go on birth control. It's going to affect the type of men that you're attracted to. I've never heard anyone address if it changes which men are attracted to her. or how attractive she is to other men.
Let me give you a scenario.
Okay.
Let me give you a research study that may shed light on this.
Okay.
Um, Again, when you take birth control pills or any kind of hormonal, it
Mhm.
could be the patch or the IUD or whatever, you're messing around with the system that God created, and the system is very, very fine tuned and very, very effective. If it's just left alone. Now, this is going to sound like a crazy example, but I think you'll see where I'm going with it.
Okay.
Um, there was research done on women that were naturally cycling. So again, naturally cycling woman is our norm,
Mhm.
from our history, from ancestry, and it's again a strange circumstance. But they went to Las Vegas to do this research,
Mhm.
and they did it with lap dancers.
Oh.
And what they did, what they did was they had these lap dancers. Some of them were on birth control.
Mhm.
Some of them were naturally cycling and in their fertile window, and some of them were naturally cycling and not in their fertile window.
Mhm.
And what they measured was how much tips, what would the percentage difference in their tips were between in the naturally cycling ones between when they were in their fertile window and when they were not in the fertile window, and then
Mhm.
then also they threw in the ones that were on birth control.
Mhm.
Only the ones that were naturally cycling and only the ones in the fertile window saw this phenomenon happen. But they ended up having 75% higher tips during that fertile window than they did during the rest of the month. And then the ones that were on birth control didn't have any. They didn't have any change, and it was all pretty much low as far as how much tips they were getting. So, in answer to your question, I think again it's an unconscious type of thing,
Mhm.
but I think there's a huge probably attraction or non-attraction if a woman is on natural, if she's naturally cycling, and so she's going into that fertile window once a month for 5 or 6 days,
Mhm.
and so I would say I don't remember offhand any studies per se on whether men, specifically are not as attracted to the birth control taking woman
Mhm.
or not. But from that angle of it, where we know that the naturally cycling woman and in her fertile window appears to be extremely attractive to
Mhm.
men, even though they don't realize why. Because
Mm.
here's the story on it. Um, during the natural cycling woman's fertile window, there are these pheromones called copulins.
Mhm.
Not to be too graphic, but during the other than the fertile window time of the month,
Mhm.
the copulins are further up inside the vagina, so they're not getting to the point where they're airborne.
Mhm.
And so during the fertile window, though, they come to the near the entrance and they become airborne. So if you're close to her, as like in the lap dancing situation, if you're in that close of proximity, the man's um, benomoral organ up in his nose, which is what happened in his nose, which is again I'm probably mispronouncing it, but it's the thing that senses. It doesn't really smell, but it senses those pheromones,
Mhm.
and that would be what was motivating them to put more money in. So they call them copulins. If I haven't said that already. So
Okay.
so um, again, there's a really fine tuned system
Mhm.
going on here between that God I think has created between men and women that's supposed to be left alone. And if it's left alone, then I think that the right people will have a tendency more than not to get together and create these marriages and families.
Mhm.
When you put hormonal birth control into the mix, you're corrupting that,
Mhm.
would be the way that I would say it.
So you also compared birth control to compared it at first to the second half of a woman's cycle, but also to pregnancy.
Mhm.
What happens when a couple is married, then the woman gets pregnant? What happens to that attraction to each other?
As far as just she hasn't been on birth control and
No birth control, just normal, naturally cycling woman gets married to a man she's attracted to, and they get pregnant. What happens to her attraction to her spouse at that point? If
hers
her,
to him.
yeah, or both to each other.
Well, it drops a bit because normally because
Okay.
her progesterone levels are higher, and
Hmm.
progesterone is really all about creating the baby,
Hmm.
so the attention goes on the baby, and the husband, if all things are equal, has a tendency to be more of a more a the fatherly thing starts happening with him as far as less of a sexual feeling for his wife and more of a
Mhm.
protective fatherly take care of her. There's even the whole sympathetic, what she's feeling, he starts feeling, and that type of thing. So on average, and again, there's exceptions because there's some women I think that feel more sexual. Again, it's rare, but they feel more sexual if they're pregnant,
Mhm.
and some men actually find women that are pregnant more sexually attractive. But
Hmm.
but but it's but it's more very rare
Mhm.
on that side of it. It's more of a they go into a different mode,
Mhm.
into the here comes parenthood mode, you know.
Yeah.
And then, as a matter of fact, when the baby's born and the father holds it for the first time or whatever, there's a pheromonal exchange that's going on, especially if like they're skin to skin.
Mhm.
There's an exchange that's going on between the two that really promotes bonding.
Okay.
His testosterone literally drops by 50% for one thing,
Okay.
and then his cortisol drops by 300%. So he's a lot a lot more chill. And then also his estrogen, which he doesn't have very much of to begin with, but it rises by 200%. Estrogen and oxytocin, which is his secondary bonding chemical,
Mhm.
and his wife's primary bonding chemical, his oxytocin and estrogen, which has risen now in him because of this baby holding the baby and the pheromonal exchange. Um, all three of those things work to bond him not only to his wife more tightly, but also now to the baby. And when
Interesting.
when I look at that whole chemical setup, that
Mhm.
whole chemical progression, I can't not think that it's designed by God to reinforce
Mhm.
monogamy and reinforce, bringing the bonding process together and really
Mhm.
kind of finalizing the bonding process because now not only the husband and wife are bonded to each other more deeply, but also they're bonded to this baby together
Mhm.
because she's been bonding to it probably already, but if she's breastfeeding, that the oxytocin
Mhm.
bond is being really, really strongly reinforced.
Interesting.
And even during the birth process, the birth process itself, her oxytocin is going up, and there's all these wondrous things that are happening now that we realize that we didn't used to, not that
Mhm.
many years ago. But the whole her biome, her biome, with the baby's born naturally, a vaginal birth,
Mhm.
then the baby's being covered by the protective elements that of her immune system, basically.
Mhm.
That's one reason why if you can avoid um, having a cesarean section, you want to try to do that
Mhm.
because it's really kind of the beginning of the baby's strong immune system. So there's all these processes that go on,
Yeah.
and they're best left alone.
Yeah. I feel like in some ways, like you said, we're learning a lot more than we used to know. I feel like in some ways having generations of women on birth control and seeing the bad effects that had, like people when they created the birth control pill, I'm sure that nobody was sitting there being like, "Oh, this will make women attracted to a different like a genetically similar type of man and
Hmm.
when she gets off the birth control, she won't be attracted to him anymore." But because we've had women on birth control, in a sense it's led to a greater appreciation for God's system that he's created
Hmm.
because we're seeing all the problems that ensue when you start taking over a woman's hormones and
Yeah,
making her body think it's pregnant all the time.
yeah,
So,
and that's kind of just the beginning because I'm looking at my notes here, so don't forget anything. Um, but they did a very large study in Denmark. As over 1 million
wow.
women, and over like 10 years. And
Mhm.
so it's like almost impossible to say that it wasn't extremely accurate. So, but what they found in it was that on birth control, the depression levels of females, and particularly the females 15 to 19 years old,
Mhm.
what we would consider the young ones, the teenagers, just were out of sight. They were 200 to 300% higher, and then especially on the methods that were not so much the oral, but the patch,
Mhm.
the IUD, the vaginal ring.
Mhm.
It just these young girls just it made them so depressed, and
Mhm.
it raised their suicidal ideation in some cases, attempts,
Mhm.
and the ones that are older than 19, it was like in the 80s and 90s,
Mhm.
percent of raising of their depression and anxiety levels. Um, but it was a terrible outcome as far as seeing that it does things to women mentally that most people don't even ever give a second thought. They take, women are on a prescribed birth control, as I'm sure you know, and as I'm sure as your audience knows, if they have any knowledge of medical matters. doctors often prescribe them to girls for like acne,
Mhm.
or if their period isn't regular,
Mhm.
if they don't think their period is regular enough, and things like that. So, um, without any thought to the types of things as far as the effect on the brain.
Mhm.
And we have a tendency, if you've been around the fitness industry or gyms, that type of thing, to think and really expect a guy that's on anabolic steroids, which is synthetic testosterone, when he starts taking those, there's often big mood changes, big personality even changes. And we accept that readily, roid rage and that type of thing. But it's basically the same thing. A woman taking hormonal birth control instead of just taking a bunch of um, synthetic estrogen and progesterone, basically. So
Mhm.
fooling their body into thinking it's pregnant. So why wouldn't that change who
Mhm.
she is? And literally, it goes beyond just changing who she's attracted to. It's also changing who she is as far as how she feels.
Mhm.
And so when again, I obviously haven't been on them myself, but from what I understand from women who go off of them, oftentimes they lost all their highs and lows in their emotions when they're
Mhm.
on hormonal birth control, and then when they go off, it comes back. Well, hopefully it comes back. Sometimes it doesn't come back. That's the scary part. Doesn't come back for a long time. They're normal,
Mhm.
cycling, and they don't necessarily get their period sometimes back.
Mhm.
I mean, their period even goes away. So it changes who they are,
Mhm.
and that's scary because most women, they want to be who they really are,
Mhm.
and the people around them too. They lose who they actually were.
I've heard it also affects their sense of smell. Would that be their actual sense of smell, or would that be that organ up in the nose that senses pheromones?
It could be some of both because I have heard that too. That
Okay.
women actually literally do. Their sense of smell changes. It
Mhm.
wouldn't surprise me because when we mess around with that hormonal structure in the brain,
Yeah.
we have a tendency to change a bunch of stuff that we didn't necessarily, intend to,
Yeah.
because the brain is so complex and that hormonal structure,
Mhm.
neurotransmitter structure as well. It's very, I think, fine tuned,
Mhm.
and to take that kind of volume of a hormone basically,
Mhm.
and expect things not to be any different. It's pretty foolish, really.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel like a lot of women aren't necessarily taught that much about their fertility, but it does affect so much of a woman's body and how she thinks and feels and just her health in general. And I feel like we're coming to a greater appreciation of that now, seeing all the really terrible effects that birth
Mhm.
control's had on women.
Yeah.
So, is there anything else you'd like to share with our audience before we wrap up for today?
Yeah, a couple of quick things. Not only all the, the other bad things we've talked about, and there really aren't that many positives, when you think about it, as far as the things that it does for you, as far as because you can control this process by just being aware of your fertility when you're fertile
Mhm.
and when you're not. I know that.
And recognize that the types of guys that you're attracted to when you're in the first half of your cycle might not always be good for you, so making sure you reevaluate them in the second half.
Yeah, being with them for a while. If
Mhm.
and particularly what I do is I try to educate, on
Mhm.
this how this whole how the sexual part of us works, both
Mhm.
males and females. And so if females become more aware of this, how their monthly cycle affects
Mhm.
them, they can be better self managers, just like the
Mhm.
males can be better self managers as well. But um, a couple other things I wanted to mention that are bad, they're downsides of hormonal birth control, and one is that it really, really drops most women's sex drive.
That
Now,
makes sense.
yeah, um, I, there's a young woman that I know that was having difficulty with her sex drive, and knowing that I was kind of the professional in the area, she came to me and wanted advice,
Mhm.
and I said to her, "Well, this I don't want to be too personal, but are you on birth control?" And she said, "Yes." And I go, "Well, that may be part of the problem."
Mhm.
And then the second thing I go, "Are you on antidepressants by chance?" And she said, "Yes." So both of those, antidepressants and birth control, both of them independently lower a woman's sex
And
drive.
you're probably on the antidepressants if a woman is taking birth control because she's more likely to be depressed as well.
Right. That's a good point. It probably boost each other, boost the
Yeah.
chances of each other. So the two together are terrible together because they just put a woman's libido through the floor, basically. So
Mm.
she went away, and I said, well, you should talk to your doctor about this, but I think the problem is at least one or both of those.
Mhm.
And so she went away, and When she came back, she had gone off of them, gone off of both. And she goes, yeah. She goes, it came back. It took a little while, but it came back.
Mm.
Um, so that's another thing that most people don't realize. And the other thing is in the trials, Colleen,
Mhm.
they really covered up a lot of this, but they're a pretty strong clot raiser. They raise the chances of a woman getting a clot, a blood clot.
Oh, interesting. That
And
makes
yeah,
yeah.
and that what there wasn't. A lot of there's been some that have died from those from blood clots going to the lungs, and they also raise cancer risks. Certain kinds of cancer, they actually lower a little bit certain kinds of cancer risk, but they raise these other ones that are more common, I guess you'd say.
Yeah, like breast cancer.
Yeah.
Yeah, we had Dr. Angela Lamfranchi on the podcast
Hmm.
back in May, I believe, May
Hmm.
or June.
Hmm.
And she was talking about that, how it can lower certain types of cancer that are pretty rare, but then it raises breast cancer, which is one of the most common types of cancer.
In my experience, and it's been quite a while now, most everything that's unnatural, when we apply it to the human person,
Hmm.
ends up having a negative effect, and some more than others.
I mean, it makes sense. If you're living a virtuous life, you're living the way that God intended you to live and you're practicing virtue, it's also going to have a effect on your like physically. We're body soul
Mhm.
composites. So doing what's good for your soul will also be good for your body. So anyway, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you for coming out and joining us in the studio and having an in-person
You're
episode.
very welcome. Thanks for having me, and again, it's been a pleasure.
And to all of our listeners, please like, subscribe, check out the new ebooks that we have coming out, and leave us a review, 5-star review, and keep on living the culture of life. God bless.